Yeah, yeah. Okay, for recording.
Hello.
Okay, here's Kim on Deleuze.
Yeah, it's the whole lecture is about the singular essence and the singularity of essence, and Deleuze uses the word interiority not very often, but I think it's really crucial to understand the view of Deleuze on this issue of essence and existence. And for example, the most simplest thing, the simplest thing has no interiority. Of course, it's not like atom or some particles, but it always it exists always as part of a complex thing for Deleuze. So there is no interiority, but just exteriority for the simplest thing. But the complex thing, for the individual, there seems to be a kind of interiority, which I hardly, which I can hardly affirm. So that's the main line of this article. So there is some kind of interior essence of a singular thing. And Deleuze says very rarely about the constitutive faculty or power of the external, which I think is crucial for understanding the modal existence and modal essence.
Do you want to point us to a passage or two so we can look at this?
Yeah, I might be able to find something. Hold on.
It's quite in earlier phase. So in page 3, in the middle,
yeah,
the third paragraph. Obviously, they have no interiority. Infinitely many terms. So fine moment. I'm trying to state first what they are not before I state what they are. I meant they have no interiority. They enter into infinite sets. The infinite set can have an interiority. And this thought, Deleuze continued in the next section, I think in section 2 and 3. He uses the image of the white wall from the short treatise. And actually, Spinoza uses the example of white wall to explain the indeterminacy of the modal essence. But for Deleuze, even in the white wall, there is some lines, some figures, and some shapes, which are still very just white, but have different degree of whiteness. And this different degree is for Deleuze kind of the modal essence, the singular essence, which is distinguished from other singular things. But I'm not sure what Deleuze says is right or not, because it sounds like that Deleuze has two very different set of theories in his theory of essence. On the one hand, there is a theory of differential calculus, and on the other hand, there is a thought of the intensive difference of degrees. So in the differential calculus, For example, everythings are different due to their order or their relation of motion and rest. But in the second thought, everything is different because of their degree in whiteness or in an attribute. So I think that these two ideas are not reconcilable easily.
I'm not sure if I understand the ideas properly yet. I would wonder, I mean, one, like from what I read, I wondered where does this talk of sets come from? And does he mean it in a set theoretical way? Or if he doesn't, then what does he mean? That was one question that I had.
Yeah, it's anachronic.
Yeah, right. It's anachronistic and it's like not, it's not motivated, at least not here. And I mean, if he uses it in the contemporary term, then I think he's making a mistake.
No, but he addresses the timing or the history of this.
About
right,
of the math.
I mean, yeah, he totally said, but I mean, you can read that in one way or another, right? Like he does say, like 17th century is like the age of the actual infinite.
Here, I'll share this.
You can read this just to be like quick. You can do this with or without Cantor.
With or without who?
Cantor.
Oh.
That's the guy who developed set theory and axiomatized infinity mathematically. And I'm not exactly convinced that what Cantor means by an infinite set covers what's interesting about Spinoza. I mean, I could say more about Cantor and Spinoza, but for Deleuze here, really the question to me is, and he might, right? Like, because I mean, like in his book on language, what's that called again? The one on Alice in Wonderland. He does talk a lot about Frege, but Frege, for example, has a very different notion of what a set is than Russell and Cantor. So I don't know. It's unclear to me why this shows up here. And the other question that I would have is, what exactly does he mean by interiority? And why
That's
is
the problem,
this
because Deleuze uses just once or twice the term of interiority in this lecture, but he doesn't explain what it is. It's a kind of, I think the intensive degree,
do you accept the exteriority, the real material exteriority? Is that not problematic as well?
For Deleuze or for
Spinoza? For you.
For me, it's not a problem.
So the interiority is a problem, but pure exterior.
Because I'm really I'm strictly obsessed with the idea of the constituent power of the external. The exteriority defines the singularity of a thing. So when we try to define one thing, we see always the different things or differentials from this try. So that's my interpretation of Spinoza's model theory. But Deleuze looks like affirm a kind of interiority of a thing from the fact that the individual is composed of infinitely many parts. There is a interiority in a thing, but I think every single parts or affections in fact, Spinoza thinks that the parts are not any kind of shapes or particles, but affections in his theory of physics. So any affections is caused by the external cause. It's not occur simply in itself. It's caused by external things. So that's why I think the concept of interiority is very problematic.
I feel like I'm not sure exactly why, but I was just going to go by intuition. I'm currently, one thing that I did read while I wasn't reading Deleuze is I reread Descartes' Rules of Motion. And I wanted to ask you something, and maybe it belongs to it, or maybe it doesn't so much. But Descartes says, and I thought that was interesting regarding other conversations that we had, that is Descartes' Rules of Motion, Rule 64. He says, I must make it clear that I recognize no kind of matter in corporeal objects, except that matter susceptible of every sort of division, shape, and motion, which geometers call quantity, and which they presuppose as the subject matter of their proofs. So here it seems, and you remember we had this conversation, right? I guess, like about like what matters to Descartes and how.
Yeah.
And I'm like in the text of that I wrote, that we read together, like I'm quoting this passage where he says, the distinction between numbers and the thing numbered, and quantity and the thing that has the quantity is a distinctio rationis. It's not a real distinction. And then like with Melamed, we I think did think about like whether that is like what we like is, if that is a kind of distinction that appears in Spinoza and like a lot of like complicated stuff. But what I thought was interesting about this quote was that here he identifies them. Here he says straight up the bat, like matter is quantity, whatever that is supposed to mean. But what I think is interesting in that is that that seems, to my mind, that seems to be very close to Spinoza. Because I think I would read Spinoza in the way that I would think substance effectively is quantity, and the differences of the differences between modes are exactly as you say, like they are determined externally. By other modes, of course. But what that means is that you have like different formations of quantity and no particles, right? Like we want to read, or like I guess we agree that like Spinoza is in no way an atomist. Right. There's no smallest part, no matter how deep you dig. I just thought it's interesting that Descartes is making this very strong statement, and it's clear, right? Like that Spinoza like sometimes picks up on things in Descartes, which in Descartes are like a little bit like unclear, or that sometimes they go in this direction, sometimes they go in that direction, and Descartes and Spinoza takes them up and says, no, we're going to push really hard in this direction. Right. Which would also fit then with like there not being any real interiority. I mean, interiority would be an aspectival relation that only exists once you have already fixed a mode. Like, of course, there are like things that are inside of me, like my bones or something. But that means that we have already fixed my form.
Right.
But from the perspective of substance, that's like a secondary distinction. And then we would think, I mean, maybe you could say something, right? Like maybe I could like suggest a distinction between interiority and intensity, where interiority is under the aspect of fixed modes, something that is in them in a literal sense. And intensity is, I mean, as we have talked the other time, right? Like under the perspective of indeterminacy, is the infinity of differently dense figurations that are, as it were, collapsed into each other. And I guess that's where you and I would disagree with Deleuze's reading of the white wall.
Mm.
Because I would think that like in the white wall, it's not about the different degrees of white. They're not even modal distinctions. I mean, it seems to me as though like Deleuze here wanted to say something about modal distinctions within white.
I think your laptop's bouncing up and down.
That's because I'm nervous and I'm moving my leg a lot. But I think what I would think is that the white wall is actually analogous to the circle example that we discussed.
Yeah.
In E2P8 and in letter 12 and in letter 81, where we could think that there are distinctions within the white wall, the circle, etc. But, and here's my new contribution, something that I'm writing about right now, or tried to write about yesterday. I would think these are conceptual distinctions. They're not real, they're not modal, they're conceptual. And what we mean by that is the kind of distinction that occurs in arithmetic geometry, where you have a formula on the one hand and a how do I have this here? Maybe where you have a formula on the one hand and a figure on the other hand. You know, so
this would be the mind of the rock, right? This is the level of conceptual you're talking about.
Can you say it again?
This would be like the mind of the rock or of the water molecule, the level of concept that you're talking about, logic.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But I'll get there. Like, so you have like, you know, x squares, you say, and the geometric representation is this, right? So we would think like both presentations, expressions, really like literally, right? Like mathematically expressions, x square and like this form, are expressions of a quantity that doesn't exist beyond those expressions. There's no like tactile or like graspable quantity x square behind its presentation, so to speak.
Is this what Deleuze might be talking about when he says a differential relation that still remains when the terms vanish?
Yeah, the thing with the vanishing, I mean, I think that's really partially what we're talking about, right? Because he seems to think there's a vanishing going on in the indefinite, which I don't see, really.
I only wanted to interject because you seem to imply that like behind just the formula of it, there's a, I don't know, behind like the actual calculation of it, there's like a form. If that's maybe I misunderstood you.
No, what I wanted to say is that exactly the quantity does not exist beyond its expression.
Yeah, right. The condition of the expression, or yes.
Right. But I would like to go back to the vanishing thing. But let me just say 2 more sentences. The thing is that, like, I thought it's a very good picture, and I actually got it from this guy René, that I met in Hamburg in January at a conference. And he suggested that, like, the difference between the attributes is really the difference that you have in between the figure and the formula. And I thought that's a really good example, but I don't think it's restricted to the attributes. I would think there's a specific kind of distinction here, which is in fact necessarily made by the intellect, but does not exist in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of how Deleuze describes the difference, describes a distinctio rationis in the principles of philosophy. But it's very muddled. I mean, you can get it out of there if you know what you're looking for. But, like, it's really like, it's like, it's unclear, attributes, modes. I can't really define my terms. Sorry. Right.
You mean the distinctio rationis not only between the attributes but also of model things, right?
I mean, the thing is that I think it's a bit tricky, and the first thing that I would say, and that's what I'm trying to write about right now, which I was really, like, pushed towards by, like, our infinite question between, like, how do, like, these isolated essences on the one hand and, like, essences as efficient causes on the other hand relate to each other, because they should be the same, and in a sense, the ones on the one hand, they're totally determinate. On the other hand, they're totally indeterminate, and that's a problem.
Yeah, right.
And
that was my original question, and I tend to direction of viewers, in fact. So the essence of a thing is really indefinite, but inherent in the attributes. So everything is always inherent in the attributes, and that point is the essence of the singular things. But if a thing is considered as a finite thing, there is always a kind of what is Entfremdung?
Alienation.
Alienation from their essence, which is inherent in attributes, but there is always a exteriority, because it's determined by the next external causes.
Yes. Yes. So, I mean, what I think is interesting is I found this, like, passage in E4 PAD. Should we look at them? Where he basically said, which is interesting because there it seems as though the conceptual distinction was not just the distinction between the attributes.
Mm-hmm. Where?
That would be E4 PAD, if that.
Okay.
I think. I'm sharing the screen. Oh. Did you disable participant screen sharing?
Oh.
Maybe only you can do it.
Let me see.
Or maybe I'm not the host anymore for some reason.
You mean part 4, proposition 8?
Right.
Demonstration.
Demonstration. Oh.
I have just German edition here. So it's about good and bad.
That is true.
Okay.
You see it? So it's towards the end. This idea is united to the emotion in the same way as mind is united to body. That is, there's no real distinction.
Yeah.
He says revera there. It's not like distinctio realis, but real distinction between this idea and the emotion or idea of the motion, of the modification of the body, save in conception alone. That's the Alves distinction, but in right here, revera non distinguitur nisi solo conceptu. So it's distinguished by concept. Ergo haec cognitio boni et mali nihil est aliud quam ipsa affectus quatenus eus dem sumus conscii. I mean, I'm not so much interested in like this point about what good and evil is, but what's interesting here is the usage of the conceptual distinction. Exactly on the spot, in the moment where he's discussing basically the two parallelisms, if you will.
Yeah, idea in part 2.
Right, like E2, P7, right? Like, and we read Melamed together. Melamed says there are two parallelisms. One is the inter-attribute parallelism, and the other one is the thought-thing parallelism. But what's interesting in this passage is that they're the same. The kind of distinction between them is the same. The kind of distinction between the mind and the body is the same kind of distinction as the idea of an affect and an affect.
Right.
Do you see that? And the name he gives to this is conceptual distinction. So that's something that I thought was interesting. So I would think that like conceptual distinction, the conceptual distinction is probably the same kind of distinction that we find within the indeterminate. Like I would think like the infinite amounts of, what was it, like rectangles within a circle, I would float are conceptually distinct.
So between the singular essences, you mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you'd have to appeal this to thought and extension.
There's just conceptual distinction in the attributes. Right.
Because then you get this intent. Then it makes sense with the intensity, right? Like if you say, okay, you have a circle, and within the circle there are infinitely many rectangles, and then you're like, okay, and the infinitely many rectangles, how do they exist? Like how are they distinct actually from the circle? How is it that like it's not either the rectangles or the circles? Well, the suggestion would be to say, well, there's conceptually distinct. And what does that mean? That means that like they're both expressions of like the same quantity or a similar quantity.
That's why I would say again that it has to like have the recourse to the actual attributes that we conceive of if you're going to go with the concept, because the concept that you refer to as parallelisms between thought and extension, referring to the same thing.
That's really an interesting
so
question.
Then at what point would these circles be like, oh, right, conceived as just the extended circles or just the conceived of circles? Yeah.
It's interesting because, I mean, one would think I'm not sure. Like the thing is that like the cardinal proposition for this kind of thing would be E2P7. But E2P7 does not rely on the distinction between the attributes.
Right.
It does rely on the thought-thing parallelism.
Mm.
And it does rely on the thought-thing parallelism by way of the definition of truths.
Mm.
Is that correct? Like, isn't it like E1A4? Like the thought has to correspond to or agree with the thing. So I wonder, and I mean, then in the reformulation of the truth criteria as adequacy, where he says, well, actually, it's only what's important is only that like everything that is like that is the case for the extended thing is already in the thought. Like it's not a representational relation, right?
Mm.
There it would also make sense to say, well, yeah, they're the same thing, but they're conceptually distinct. So I wonder, oh yeah, and in the same, around the same, like in the later parts of like the rules of motion by Descartes, Descartes basically says that, like he says, like there's no, let me try and dig this up. Anyway, so one question is that I have about this is what is primary? That's I take it that's Andrea's question also. Is it the distinction between the attributes, or are the attributes a result of the thought-thing parallelism in a way, and the conceptual distinction between them? Which would be interesting regarding Melamed, right? Because Melamed says, no, they're like two cookie cutter cut different parallelisms here. The one is thought thing and the other one is interattribute. Okay, that was a lot of nonsense, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So as I once said, I think that the distinction between interattribute and thought thing parallelism is not adequate, I think, because both of them are introduced in Spinoza's system to assert the oneness of the thought and body, or the prime profoundness of the body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing, and to use this kind of conceptual distinction in order to understand the differences between the single essences. But it's like the conceptual distinction means they are all same, one thing, but just conceptually different. So, but the triangle and the circle, how can you say their oneness or their sameness?
Yeah, that's a good question. For the first part, that's, I think, why I thought of like this quote in Descartes, where Descartes says, actually, quantity is matter. Because if you link this with Spinoza, in my opinion, saying very clearly that substance is quantity, like it's a little bit like behind closed doors, but if you look at it, you can see that. Then I wondered how far substance itself is matter. And you could actually turn him into like a really radical materialist. Much more radical than I've seen anybody do it.
As you properly said, for Descartes, the substance is resting matter, and for Spinoza, it's already self-determined moving matters, or the velocity itself. So it's quite different view, I think. So when you think the substance, the extended substance or the attribute extension as like a resting matter or whole quantity, I think we lose something to understand Spinoza's view of extension. So I think only the name is same by Descartes and by Spinoza, the extension. But what Spinoza mean by this term, extension, is totally different view.
And I perfectly agree with that. The thing is, like, let me rephrase. I wonder if Spinoza really means by substance itself matter,
Mm-hmm.
and then matter can be comprehended as extension, or matter can be comprehended as idea.
I think matter would have to be motion and matter.
Yeah, that's the thing. I wonder if, like, Spinoza. I'm just going to push this
motion
now,
and
okay? Like, I'm
extension.
just going to be like hypermaterialism Spinoza girl for a moment.
Yeah, I agree.
And then I would like to ask you.
I agree at this point. Yeah. Spinoza think that the quantities matter and the substances matter. Yeah, even the ideal substance or the intellect also is also matter, because I think it's proved in the E1P 15S. So when Spinoza says about substance, Spinoza just say about the material thing, the matter. Yeah, I agree at this point, but
I would like to hear, Luce, like what you were going to say about this material extremism, but then I was also going to ask you right after if you would agree with Kim's critique of the interiority and on what level.
Right.
No, yeah, I mean, I wanted to respond to that, but like,
go ahead,
thank you
yeah.
for
Do
the
your whole
reminder.
thing.
But like, I mean, if we, and I think I'm very, okay, like as materialism girl, I would think, okay, I'm convinced that that really Spinoza means there's only one substance, not two, as Descartes would have it. And people usually read him as saying there's only one substance, but it cannot be qualified in a way. It's just this like unity kind of thing. But as materialism Spinoza girl, I would think, no, it can be qualified and it's matter. Okay, and then it can be like comprehended under different attributes, and two of them are known to us, and one is extension, that's extended matter, and the other one is thought, which is thought matter. If that's the picture, then my question is, what is thought? Like, how is thought a kind of matter?
Well, you said it yourself, right? Like an internal concept or mathematics almost, or geometry, ordinal geometry as in the title.
I don't understand.
Like you may remember in some of my emails, I was referring to like the internal geometries of heat baths in physics. It's referred to as internal geometries of like what systematic program or rapport of motion sustains what we know as a solid state of matter, temporarily solid state.
I don't think I understand that.
It's kind of
that's a sense of your concept in the rock, of the mind of the rock, in a way a concept in matter that is not psychic at all, but sort of logical merely. But I don't mean to detract you. I just
No, this is really a question for me, because if I, like if I mean, one of the questions is, when Descartes here says that like quantity is really just matter, what does he mean? That is unclear to me. The other question is that like, if substance in Spinoza is really just matter and it can be extended or thought, then my question is, what is thought?
Right, because it's not thought of matter, it must be thinking in matter. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, the radical materialist way of thinking this would be that like thought is just a kind of matter.
Yeah.
It's not something completely different.
Right. Distinction between the thought and the body in this case.
It's not like the body
same
thought, you know?
Same meta thought as thought and thought as extension. So yeah.
But how do you make sense of that? Is that like something in me, inside of me, really resists that? I'm thinking like, huh? But thought cannot be matter.
Right, because you thought the body would think the thing, right? But then we're not really thinking two parallel equal attributes. We're saying that we actually believe that there's a body that thinks the thought, which means we're not really believing in the mind of the stone or the mind of the drop of water.
No, I can totally think of the mind of the body, of the drop of water. But what I always think is that like the mind is like radically different.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because the attribute of thought is like comprehended in itself, and it cannot have any relation to the attribute of extension. But the point is that like,
I would wonder if the mind is what establishes the interiority by like directing what this pattern or rapport of motion and rest is. Like within the extension. So the mind is the orchestrator in a sense of, you know.
So for Deleuze, what leads to interiority is not intellectual thing or thought, but it's the internal ratio or relation of the parts. That's the problem, I think, because the parts is caused by the other things, but Deleuze never says about that. But he says as if a totally closed thing, so with a border, and within there are infinitely many parts, which has some kind of complex relations, which belongs to this individual, not the other individual. So that's the interiority by a complex individual, a complex thing or compound thing for Deleuze. And this structure of relation is characteristic relation of the motion and rest of the parts. And Deleuze named this characteristic relation as the singular essence. So the interior order and connection of the parts.
Yeah.
Infinitely many terms.
And the term is rapport in French.
Right.
Which I would encourage we use in English, as we use it. Rapport.
Do you want to say something about like the translation of rapport into relation? Because your French is like probably better than ours, or like mine at least.
Well, relation does just fine, but a rapport I think suggests something like almost recognition and familiarity, and more of this orchestraic tone. I mean, it's precisely just a slight inflection, but I think it's nice because and then it starts to imply the interiority. And he does use the term like based on a relation is sous un rapport, so it's under a rapport. And so it's like under sort of the controller, once again, like the orchestration of. And so and that's why I like to think of it almost as like the mind, but like the mind is simply just this sort of logic of the real, or a sort of geometry internal to the way any individual comes into being. Yes, this individual. I mean, he says that the individual singular essence is just a degree, but then a degree is sort of just like the measure of this particular rapport, right? Something like this.
Right.
And I don't think that is so problematic. I don't know, especially since like these parts only really come to be what they are in the relation in the first place, and they're uncountable.
I think it's problematic because Deleuze denies the total interiority of the particular of the particles it's not particles, but just a differential vanishing terms for Deleuze, but somehow he reintroduces the atomist thought to understand the individual, because it consists of the parts. An individual consists of the parts. Of course, it's the relation of the composition. It's not just the from the small atom to the bigger quantity, but it's relation. But this
is what it says in Spinoza. He's being really true to the letter. This is the simple body. In fact, I brought up the simple body to you in another moment, and
I think there is no simple body at all in reality. It's just.
Wouldn't you have to take that up with Spinoza himself?
Pardon?
Wouldn't you then have to take that up with Spinoza himself?
Yeah, Spinoza is wrong about that.
Well, that's okay, but yeah, so let's make it about Spinoza then, not Deleuze.
I think the simplest thing is introduced in order to understand the complex things. So it's just the kind of Hilfskonstruktion, the auxiliary construction for educational purposes.
Well, I would think that, like, I mean, Deleuze has something to say about that, right? Like, Deleuze seems to say there are no, like, simple things, most simple things in an atomistic way, like, at least explicitly, he says. They are infinitely intensified, we could say. Like, they're, like, infinitely, like, they're, like, really complex, like Russian puppets. Is that what you call this? Like, they're like stuck into each other, but infinitely. But still, like everything is composed of other things, and these things that they are composed of, like on the first level, so to speak. That's how I understand him. These are the simple things. So it doesn't seem to me, so I would be composed of arms and legs and a heart and, you know, things like that. But then my heart is like composed of, I don't know, whatever is in the heart. And then like that thing like in the heart, like, I don't know, the left chamber of my heart is itself composed of, et cetera, ad infinitum. I think that's how I understand Deleuze.
Yeah. Right. It's a little bit similar to the very vague understanding of the quantum physics. So in the quantum area, there is no stable electronics, but just a how can I say, analytic or analyzable instability like that. So vanishing terms. There is just vanishing terms, but this kind of...
Oh, that's where the vanishing is coming in. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense with his like virtuality and stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like Schrödinger's cat. But I think Spinoza doesn't think about this kind of small particle or vanishing terms at all. It's kind of educational instrument to say about the simplest thing, and to introduce the concept of the constituent power of the external, because the simplest thing has just externality caused by other things, caused by the external things. And Spinoza wanted to say, I think, that the individuals are also constituted or determined by external things, like the simplest thing, but very complex way. It is that what Spinoza thought on this issue of individuality, and there is no interiority or closeness of an individual at all in the finite, among the finite individuals, but only one individual is internally closed. It is the nature, the whole nature, whole universe.
Why do you jump from internal to internally closed? I think this is the reduction I constantly encounter in philosophy and science, and I think it's very reductive that we have an all or nothing approach to individuality. I keep trying to imply that a porous border can give you what you're looking for, give you individuality and not a closed atomistic universe. We can be interconnected and encapsulated individuals with senses of interiority that bleed into one another, that don't contradict other interiorities.
Like permeation.
Like, why is it so hard to conceive of? Like, yeah, like, why can't we have our cake and eat it too a little bit in this sense? Because it just seems too simple to be like, well, there's just no interiority. And then it just seems to like close off huge metaphysical questions. And it just seems too simple. It seems like discomforts to resolve this problem very easily and just move on. You know, do you see what I'm saying? Like, maybe this is too blunt, but I just, or maybe not even argued, but I just feel.
No, I feel you.
Yeah, it's really tricky question, but
because this union of just a temporary dance, it's not threatening to me as an interiority. It doesn't say I am now my own universe and I have no relation to what I was before. And in terms of like my body was part of other bodies before.
I want to suggest that like maybe that is exactly. Maybe it can be captured by the distinction I floated earlier between interiority and intensity. Like if we understand it like that like interiority is this like hard ass, mechanistic, clear lines, border control, policing kind of thing.
Yeah.
That'd be interiority. And we don't like that. We think that's wrong. Okay, and then the question is, can intensity capture permeation and osmosis, so to speak? Like, can there be like in Germany would say Durchlässigkeit, which is the translation of permeation. But durchlassen means really, I mean, literally it means like letting throughness. Like, can it be like a border that lets things through? Maybe only particular things.
Like a cell wall, or not a cell wall, but a cell membrane. It's a semi-permeable, porous mechanism, selectively permeable.
Right, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Can I jump in and like try and like seize the opportunity to like try and respond to the second question about like we agree that like there's a conceptual distinction between the idea of the circle and the circle, but the question is, how is it that is that the same kind of distinction that we find between the idea of the circle and the infinitely many ideas of rectangles within the circle? Because my suggestion would be that like maybe we can capture the permeability of existence in that way somehow. Like I think like the direction that I would like to push this to is to think that interiority is a problem because it presupposes real distinctions. And the problem is that like if you kick out interiority completely, then what you're left with is, so to speak, only either like one plane of existence where like everything is the same, and that seems unspecific.
The Hegel's critique on Spinoza.
Right. Exactly. You end up with acosmism in a way. Or you end up with what Gila, for example, would say is that there are only modes without any kind of unity.
Only differential modes. So.
Yes.
Only vanishing modes.
Yeah, right. And to my mind, that's also unspecific. It's not just unspecific because I don't think that that's what Spinoza says. but it's also unspecific because, I mean, there's a reasoning behind that like is not only Spinoza, that I think comes from even Sina actually, that something guarantees not even the unity, but the heterogeneity of these modes towards each other. They're not just like randomly there, like in, like, I don't know, in nothingness, like floating around or something like that. That doesn't seem to be the case. That it's a heterogeneous, it's an order of heterogeneity, but with a relation, like in a relation.
So they have to have a relation to each other in the same way that existing things do, like in Proposition 28 of Part 1.
Yes, exactly.
So how is a mode both like kind of not existing and existing? Because it's an essence, right? Like,
it's not nonsense. For example, in Buddhism, there is a saying. There is a saying like in the perspective, from the perspective of the difference, there are only differentiations, but in the perspective of the sameness, there is always the same thing. For example, when I think of myself, in the perspective of the sameness, I'm always me from my birth to my death. But in the perspective of the difference, there are no moment, no moment of the remaining myself, but just it's infinitely many death and rebirth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth in every moment. But we can think both of them, the oneness of myself and the difference of myselves. So
right, and I think my suggestion is, or what I would like to think is that, like, despite these like hard distinctions, right, like real distinctions or modal distinctions, maybe there can be a softer distinction. And I would suggest that conceptual distinction is a soft distinction in that it allows for different expressions that are not contradictory, but are heterogeneous, to exist at the same time as expressions of the same thing. And my impression is that that's what's going on in the thought-thing parallelism, that it's the same, but like the sameness is a soft sameness. It's not saying it's 100% identical. That is obviously not the case. Like Spinoza would himself say, the idea of a circle is not a circle. It's not circular. But it's the same in that it like forms a heterogeneous thing as expressions of something, and that also means that like there's no 100% hard distinction between them. It's not that like you could say the one ends here and the other one starts there. I mean, it's a hard distinction in that like one attribute cannot have anything to do with another attribute. But you cannot like in the Aristotelian idea of substances say, well, this is my phone and this is me. Okay, now the question is, can we bring this together with the thought of intensities? Like in which we would say that like infinitely many rectangles are inhering in a circle. Can we say that like different essences are conceptually distinct and not really distinct and not modally distinct? That would be the question, right? Like the question would be like can the inherence relation, as it were, be explicated by way of a conceptual distinction? And I would say, I would think yes. I would think yes in a way that makes sense to me. Like to think that just as the figure in the formula of x square is are conceptually distinct, but really like lead us back to the same thing. In that way, I would also think like the infinity of rectangles within the circle, covering the same ground, so to speak, is conceptually distinct. Is another way of expressing that same ground, as it were. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But because then you could say like, right, and in that sense, on the level of essences, there are only conceptual distinctions.
Right.
There are no modal distinctions. Modal distinctions are only distinctions between existing things.
Sorry, so within the whole of nature as an individual, every other individual would just be a conceptual distinction? Is that the radical
In the
level
dimension
you're
of
taking it to, or no?
in the dimension of essence, there is just, in my word, internal distinction or internal partition of things or over things' essences. But
well, that's what you would mean by eternal partition. Interesting.
Yeah, I would like to introduce this concept by the interpretation of E to P 11 C and S. So yeah, when God think just when God has just the idea of mind, then I'm a whole thing. But when God has the idea of mind and the idea of thing A, then A and me has distinction. And I'm determined by the idea of B, and B determined by idea of mind. So that's what Spinoza says in this corollarium.
And God must have all thoughts at all times, so both must be equally true.
But God is not so important in this corollarium. In fact,
can we look at that together real quick?
Yeah.
Sure.
I think we were at this like corollarium like probably 3 times together.
What is it again?
It's E2P11C.
All right, I'll put it on the screen. So it's in the video.
Oh yeah, of course. Like the what I would also like to say, and I think that is more certain than my take on circles and rectangles, is that whenever Spinoza uses quaternions, whenever he uses insofar as, he's indicating conceptual distinction.
Right. So this idea I have also, and I must say, for example, God think the idea of mine and this cup, this glass, as my idea, then we are one thing. My body is extended to this glass. But God has the idea of myself and the glass differently at the same time. Then we have the external relations.
Exactly. Then it's a modal distinction.
Yeah. And in this,
but the modal distinction itself is just an aspect, is in itself only conceptually distinct.
Right.
From
so every
the reality of substance.
Every finite things are distinguished from each other to each other in this way, just in this way. So there is no finite thing at all in the attributes of God, because they are all inherent in God. So finite things is just occurs from the other finite things. That's what Spinoza says in, I think, E4, P8 or P, 4. I don't know. There is no thing in the nature which is not determined by other things.
Is that not E1,
I think it's
P28?
insofar as it's a finite thing. But the whole nature as an infinite thing, there is no external determination. And in this way, so everything is one thing or one whole. And we can say in this case, the internal partition, like the essence of the glass and essence of my body or essence of other affections of God, but they are just internally distinguished.
I think I have to like head out soon, maybe in like 5 or 10 minutes. I just thought I'd mention that, but I perfectly agree. Like as I said, I mean, I would call it, I think, a conceptual distinction, partially because there's this nice passage in E4 P8D where he basically does call that relation a conceptual distinction, and in that passage he covers all of them. I am not exactly sure if he ever uses it again or if he uses it ever before. I doubt it. But can we briefly look at like E1 P5?
Something interesting here is like, I'm looking at
or extra intellectus as well is a indicator of the distinctio rationis. Extra intellect.
What did you say before?
So out of the intellects, there is no something, etc.
Lucy said.
Huh? What?
Where are we going?
Sorry, I just want to, because like in E1 P5, he says there are two kinds of distinctions: modal and attributive. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's our passage. And I was just thinking, I was wondering if that contradicts this talk about conceptual distinctions or internal parts, you said?
Yeah.
So you would think an internal part is a part that is conceptually distinct from its whole.
Right.
And neither modally nor really.
They are one and the same thing, but just conceptually, we can say it's A and B.
Ah, yeah, okay. So you would think like an internal part is an aspect, is what Yitzhak would call an aspect.
Yeah. For example, when I'm riding my bike, there is one body going forward, and there is no distinction between my body and the body of the bike. But when I see my body, see the bicycle, there is a real, not real, but finite distinction between my bike and my body.
Yeah, that would
Spinitude?
no, that makes sense to me. Like that, if you say, okay, so now we can puzzle it together. I think we would think like there are conceptual distinctions. Conceptual distinctions are distinctions in the way in which the figure and the formula of arithmetic geometry are distinguished. There are both expressions of the same thing. Okay, they are conceptual distinctions. They work like this. And if you look at a part that is integrated into a whole, but you don't look at it as severed from it, and you don't look at it as just something that dissolves in the whole.
Right.
Then you have something that I think I would call an aspect. and you would call it an internal part.
Right.
But we agree in saying that like this internal part slash aspect is only conceptually distinct from the whole.
Mm.
Right.
Isn't
and that's
that
interesting
conceptual
because that
distinction
makes sense.
mean everything? Isn't that just like, doesn't that make the difference in the world, is what I'm saying, that it's
Yes.
conceptually distinct? Because otherwise, yes, of course, everything is substance. But even in your example, Kim, the conceptual distinction leads to the mind of bike and body being joined, which means the bodies are joined, which means that the conceptual distinction is the distinction of existence itself. It is the ultimate distinction of all levels. Once we say merely conceptual distinction, well, that means the mind and its corresponding extension. And that's the way that was argued with the example that Kim gave too.
What do you mean by the mind? The mind of my body, or
whichever thing happens to come into the emergence of, well, it's either my body right now or my body in the chair or my body in the bicycle. When is it ever just my body?
So the mind has also no
but we're naming it
interiority.
and we're conceiving of it. And that means minds exist. Minds are coming into being between me and my computer.
Yeah. And the mind and the idea is one and the same thing for Spinoza. So for example, in an activity, so in the definition of the activity, the activity means not being affected, affecting, but any kind of being affected or affecting, but as a whole causation is the definition of the activity for Spinoza. So when we act as a whole, my body and my bike, there is no distinction here.
And so when we act as a whole of all things in nature, is there any distinction from God?
Right. The whole nature is always acting. So any acting in the world is the participation of this acting. So insofar as we are acting, we are acting only by the virtue of our own essence. Because there is no distinction between me, my action, and the whole nature's action. In the passivity, it's a whole different thing. Because in the passivity, my body is just a partial cause of some sequence of a causation. So in this sense, my body is distinguished from the other external bodies. For example, the imagination of the bike, when I'm riding my bike, is caused by the external bike. So insofar as I consider my bike as my bike, so conceptually externally distinguished from my body, then the two bodies are distinguished externally. But when I'm riding my bike, insofar as the composite body going forward, there is no distinction.
If I may stop you for a second, I think this is where you get into anthropomorphism, and you really rely on your own idea of what a mind is from a human perspective, and what a thought is from an embodied mind with consciousness.
Right.
And you're forgetting the mind of the stone, and you're forgetting the mind of God. For the mind of God is in all places at once. So the mind of God is at once thinking already your body by itself, your body with all of nature as one body, your body with the bike, and all of things all at once. So it's both and.
The
you
mind
have
of
the
the
interiority
bike
and the exteriority simultaneously. And God can't account for that with all of his omnipotent thought. His mind, because like in the last thing we just saw, the E2P11, what was it, C? When I have a thought, it's already a thought that was internal to the mind of God. That's what it just said. That means God had that thought before I had the thought. It's part of one of his infinite thoughts. And that's again what I'm trying to make the point as. It's like when you have these exteriorities, these moments when you consider, no, it's not when you consider, it's happening all at once, because God's happening all at once, and God has the idea of you, the idea of the bike, the idea of you and the bike, the idea of you and the bike and all of nature. Does that make sense? Because
I mean,
otherwise, if it's
that,
just
like,
my mind, then this is a projection. You know?
I mean, it seems to me that, like, I mean, that what's special about the divine intellect is that in the divine intellect there are only conceptual distinctions.
Right.
There are no modal distinctions because there's no externality. It's not caused by anything else. And I would think that's the only difference, really, between my mind and God's mind. And that also means that, like, that my mind is an aspect or an internal part of the divine intellect of God's mind, I would think. And what I think is interesting about that is that it says that really the divine intellect is not so special. It just happens to be the one that covers all of them. It's not any more special than, like, the idea that I have of this body is over against the idea of the bike. It's exactly the same thing. It just so happens that one of them covers all of the others, and that's all. It's not, you know, it's not sacred. It's not.
I guess, I mean, it's like
you're
now
not,
at motion,
you're not better
now
than
at
me
rest.
just because you're 10 centimeters taller than me. That is the same difference.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. Like, now at motion, now at rest. Well, all at the same time. That's what I mean. Now this idea, now this thought, now that thought, but also all the thoughts.
Right, but, like, within the divine intellect, there are only aspects. They are not opposite.
Or affections.
Yeah.
But,
no?
Yeah. It's already 11 o'clock, and I think I can introduce this kind of explanation of internal partition and external partition next time, because I'm writing about this right now, and
share like 5 pages and like we'll like really analyze it closely.
Cool. Then I'll share something about conceptual distinctions.
Yeah.
I mean, I already started that in the thing that I sent the other day.
Okay.
There's like 2 pages. But I'm currently trying to, like, expand that a bit and, like, write more about Descartes and, like.
But do you want to take a session each maybe to like just read it and like we do like a presentation almost?
No, let's just like keep it to like 7 pages max, so we have 15 in total.
Okay, and then we just do them together, the 2 of them.
Right, and if we don't manage anything, then like we can both just introduce these things and like point us out.
I think I will have maximum 10 page or less. Yeah.
Okay, great.
If you guys ever feel like you want to tell me to read something in Spinoza, you can. Like if you feel like, oh, Andrea might be able to understand more if they were to have read this in Spinoza, you can tell me that too. Like homework. You know what I'm saying?
Once again, yeah.
I'm happy with the way we're going.
Like if you want me to read a little bit of Spinoza in preparation to be more, you know.
Okay.
You just let me know.
Not really. I really want to explain clear and distinctively.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward.
I'll try.
This is a great text to read, by the way. I thought it was very good.
Yeah, the text in German. Have you read already?
Which one?
What I sent you.
Yeah, no, I replied to you. I can't read it. I'm so sorry.
Unfortunately, just in German, but it's the parts. The part 1 is about the principle of individuation, and the part 2 is the method or the the condition of the individuation, and the principle of individuation. 2 principles: the internal and external. Yeah.
Cool.
I'm writing. Yeah.
Amazing. I'm looking forward. And then we're meeting in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Let me turn this off.